There's a particular way of being alive that Carl Jung believed was the quietest tragedy a person could live inside. You wake up, you meet your obligations, you do what's expected, and underneath all of it, there's a sentence running on a loop that you've stopped even noticing. Not yet. This isn't the real thing yet. The real life, the one that counts, the one where you finally become who you're supposed to be. That starts later, when the money's right, when the kids are grown, when you feel ready, when something out there finally shifts and gives you permission to begin. Jung had a name for this. He called it the provisional life, and he spent decades watching people spend their entire existence inside it, holding their breath, waiting for a signal that never came. The provisional life is what happens when you treat your present as a rehearsal for some real performance that's always scheduled for a date you never quite reach. You're not living, you're preparing to live. You're managing, coping, getting through, keeping things stable enough that when the real life finally starts, you'll be in position to step into it. And the cruelest part, the part Jung understood better than almost anyone, is that from the inside, it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like exactly what a sensible person is supposed to do. Today, I want to walk you through what Jung discovered about this suspended way of living, why we slip into it without ever deciding to, how it quietly consumes years and then decades, what it actually costs you at the deepest level, and what it takes to finally exhale and step into a life that's happening now instead of one you keep promising yourself for later. Because if some part of you has been feeling that low, persistent hum of a life on pause, the sense that you're waiting for something you can't name, Jung would tell you that feeling is not a flaw in you. It's the most honest thing about you. It's the part that knows. Let me start with what Jung actually saw. Working with people across every kind of circumstance, the wealthy and the struggling, the successful and the stuck, he noticed a pattern that cut across all of it. Person after person would arrive describing a life that looked, on paper, like it was functioning. Careers intact, relationships steady, nothing obviously broken. And yet they carried this heaviness they couldn't explain, a flatness that no achievement seemed to lift. When Jung listened closely, he kept hearing the same hidden assumption underneath their words. They spoke about their lives in the future tense. Everything meaningful was coming. Nothing meaningful was here. He came to understand that these people had made an unconscious bargain. They had agreed to postpone their real existence in exchange for safety. As long as the real life hadn't started yet, it couldn't fail. As long as they were still preparing, they never had to risk finding out what they were actually capable of. The provisional life is a hiding place dressed up as a plan. Think about how this begins, because it almost never begins as a decision. It begins as a reasonable delay. You're 23, and you take the job that isn't quite right because you need the experience, and the real work will come later. You're 28, and you stay in the city that drains you because it's practical, and you'll move somewhere that feels like home once your footing is more secure. You're 34, and you tell yourself the relationship is fine for now, that the deeper thing you're hungry for will be possible once life calms down. Each individual delay is defensible. Each one makes sense on its own. And that's exactly how the trap closes, not with one big surrender, but with 1,000 sensible postponements that quietly stitch themselves into a way of life. Jung noticed that the provisional life has a specific psychological signature. There's always an if only, or a once I. Once I have enough saved, then I'll take the risk. If only my situation were different, then I'd become who I really am. The condition is always external, always somewhere in the future, and always just far enough away that you never actually have to test it. The person living provisionally isn't lazy and isn't foolish. Often they're the most diligent, capable, dutiful people you'll ever meet. They're pouring enormous energy into their lives. The energy just isn't going into living. It's going into maintaining the holding pattern. And here's the thing about a holding pattern. A plane in a holding pattern is burning fuel the entire time. It looks like it's flying, it's moving, it's using power, it's staying aloft, but it isn't going anywhere. It's circling the same patch of sky, waiting for a clearance to land that hasn't come. That's what the provisional life does to a person. It burns your years at the same rate a real life would, but it never touches down. You can feel this even when you can't name it. It shows up as a strange restlessness on ordinary evenings, a sense that you should be happier than you are given how much you've done right. It shows up in the way certain songs or smells or old photographs can suddenly open a hollow ache in your chest, because some part of you remembers a version of your life that felt alive and immediate, back before you learned to defer everything. It shows up in the fantasy you keep returning to, the one about the different life, the one you never let yourself take seriously because it isn't practical. That fantasy isn't a distraction. Jung would tell you it's a message. It's the part of you that hasn't agreed to the postponement, still knocking on the door. Now here's where it gets harder, and where Jung's insight becomes genuinely uncomfortable. We like to imagine the provisional life is forced on us, that circumstances trapped us, that we had no choice, that responsibilities pinned us in place. And sometimes there's real truth in that. Life does hand people brutal constraints. But Jung was unflinching about a deeper layer underneath the circumstances. For many people, the provisional life isn't a prison they were locked into. It's a shelter they built, and then forgot they were the ones holding the door shut. Because as long as you haven't fully committed to your life, you get to keep every possibility open. The unwritten novel is a masterpiece as long as it stays unwritten. The business you never launched can't go bankrupt. The bolder, freer version of yourself remains flawless and untested as long as you never actually try to become them. Commitment is terrifying precisely because it forecloses. To choose this life, this work, this person, this path, is to kill off all the other lives you might have had. And the provisional life lets you avoid that death indefinitely. You stay in the waiting room, surrounded by all your unlived possibilities, and you call it keeping your options open. Jung saw this most clearly in people who were, by every external measure, gifted. The ones with obvious talent, obvious intelligence, obvious potential. They often struggled the most to actually commit to anything, because their potential was so precious to them that they couldn't bear to spend it. Spending it meant risking it. Realizing a talent means subjecting it to reality, to failure, to being merely good instead of infinitely promising. So they hoarded their potential like a fortune they were afraid to invest, and they lived their whole lives rich in possibility and starved of experience. If that lands somewhere tender in you, stay with it for a second instead of flinching away. The recognition itself is the beginning of something. There's a second face to the provisional life that's worth looking at directly, because it doesn't always wear the mask of grand, unlived dreams. Sometimes it's much smaller and much sadder. Sometimes the provisional life is just endurance. It's the person who has quietly decided that this, the marriage that went cold, the job that hollowed them out, the town they never chose, this is just what they have to get through. They're not waiting for a masterpiece. They're waiting for it to be over. They've moved their whole life into a kind of survival mode and forgotten there was ever another way to be. They tell themselves they're being strong, and they are strong. But Jung would gently point out that endurance is not the same as living, and that a strength which only ever serves to help you tolerate a life you don't want is a strength being spent on the wrong thing entirely. What both faces share is the same core, the assumption that now doesn't count, that this stretch of time you're currently standing in is somehow provisional, disposable, a bridge to the real thing rather than the real thing itself. And that assumption, Jung realized, is the great lie the mind tells to protect itself from the weight of being fully present in an uncertain life, because being fully present is heavy. When you decide that this life, right now, is the real one, the only one you're actually going to get, everything sharpens. Every choice starts to matter. Every wasted afternoon carries a small sting. The stakes come rushing in, and the mind, which is always trying to keep you comfortable, would much rather keep the stakes at a safe distance by insisting the real game hasn't started yet. The provisional life is, at bottom, a way of refusing to accept that the clock is already running, that it's been running the whole time. And this is the part almost nobody wants to hear. The clock does not wait for you to feel ready. Jung watched people wait for readiness, the way you might wait for a bus that was never scheduled to come. They believed that one day the fear would lift, the confidence would arrive, the conditions would align, and then they'd begin. What he understood, and what he tried to help them see, is that readiness in that sense is a fantasy. Nobody who ever did anything real felt ready first. The readiness comes from the doing, not before it. You don't wait to feel like a different person and then live differently. You live differently, and the different person forms in the wake of it. So the sentence, "You can't live like this forever," isn't a threat and it isn't a scolding. It's a simple statement of fact that most of us spend enormous energy not looking at. You cannot, in fact, live like this forever. Not because someone will stop you, but because forever is not on offer. The provisional life makes a silent promise it can never keep, the promise that there will be time. That the real life is safely stored up ahead, waiting for you to collect it whenever you finally get around to it. And there simply isn't an unlimited supply of later. At some point, the postponements run out of road. Before we go further into what it takes to actually break this pattern, I want to mention something for anyone feeling that specific ache right now. The sense of a life half-lived, of years spent in a holding pattern you didn't consciously choose. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises built directly out of Jung's work, designed for exactly this kind of moment. The moment you start to suspect the real life you've been waiting for has been quietly available the whole time, and you're not sure how to step into it. It's not a quick fix and it won't rush you. It's more like a set of honest questions to sit with while you figure out what you've been postponing and why. The link's right below. Now let's keep going, because understanding the trap is only half of it. The other half is the way out. So what actually happens when someone finally stops? When the postponement collapses and they're forced to confront the life that's been happening to them all along? Jung observed that it almost never begins gracefully. It usually begins with a rupture. Something breaks the spell of later, a diagnosis, a death, a marriage that finally ends, a milestone birthday that arrives with a horrible clarity, where you look up and realize a whole decade slid past while you were busy preparing. These moments are brutal, but Jung came to see them as strange mercies, because they do what years of comfortable postponement never could. They shatter the illusion that there's infinite time. And in the wreckage of that illusion, a person meets a question they've been dodging their whole life. If this is it, if this is the only life I get, then what am I actually doing with it? That question is the doorway. And I want to be honest with you about what's on the other side of it, because Jung was honest about it. The first thing you feel when you finally stop waiting isn't freedom, it's terror. Because the whole architecture of the provisional life was built to protect you from exactly this, from the exposure of committing, from the risk of trying and finding out, from the loss of all those pristine, unlived possibilities. When you set down the waiting, you feel skinless for a while. Everything you were protecting yourself from comes rushing in at once. There's grief in it too, and Jung didn't pretend otherwise. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the ache of acknowledging the years that went into the holding pattern, the recognition that some doors really have closed while you stood in the waiting room. You can't step into a real life without first mourning, at least a little, the one you kept promising yourself and never lived. That mourning is not a sign you've done something wrong. It's the toll you pay at the border between the provisional life and the real one, and everyone who crosses pays it. But here's what Jung saw on the far side of that mourning, and it's the reason any of this matters. When people finally stopped treating their lives as a rehearsal, something in them came back online that they had forgotten was even switched off. A vividness, an immediacy. The colors of ordinary days got brighter. The same life that had felt flat and provisional started feeling saturated and real. Not because the circumstances changed, but because the person finally showed up for them. They stopped watching their life from the waiting room window and walked out into the middle of it. Jung called the larger process behind all of this individuation, the slow work of becoming the specific person you actually are, rather than the placeholder you've been maintaining. And individuation cannot happen in the future tense. It can only happen now, in the concrete texture of an actual, committed, imperfect life. You cannot individuate in a waiting room. The real self doesn't form in preparation, it forms in participation. It takes shape through choices that cost something, through commitments that close doors, through the ordinary friction of a life you've actually decided to live rather than merely survive. And this is where the real reframe lands. Most people believe they have to become ready before they can commit. Jung understood it runs the other way entirely. The commitment is what makes you. When you finally choose this work, this person, this place, this life, you're not just picking an option off a menu. You're gathering yourself into a single point. All that scattered energy that was going into keeping your options open, into maintaining the holding pattern, into hedging every bet, it consolidates. It becomes force. And a person who has committed, even to something modest, even to something the provisional dreamer would sneer at, has a kind of gravity and aliveness that the eternal waiter never touches. I want to give you a picture of what this looks like, because the abstract only carries you so far. Imagine someone who spent 15 years telling themselves they'd get serious about the thing they loved once life settled down. They kept the loved thing at the edges, a hobby, a maybe, a someday. They were good at their sensible life and quietly hollow inside it. Then something cracks the spell. Doesn't matter what, a loss, a scare, a birthday that hits like a fist. And instead of building a new holding pattern, they do the terrifying thing. They give the loved thing a real place in their week. Not their whole life, not some dramatic burning it all down. Just a real, committed, non-negotiable place. A few hours that actually count. And what they discover shocks them. It's not that the loved thing suddenly becomes their salvation. It's that the act of finally committing to something real sends a signal through their entire psyche. If this counts, maybe the rest of it counts too. Maybe the marriage isn't a life sentence to endure, but a relationship they could actually be present inside. Maybe the job isn't a holding cell, but a place they could bring their real self to. The commitment in one corner of life starts to dissolve the provisional fog across all of it. That's the pattern Jung watched again and again. You don't have to fix everything at once. You have to stop waiting somewhere, and the aliveness spreads from there. There's a subtler cost to the provisional life that Jung was especially attuned to, and it's worth naming before we close, because it's the one that does the most damage over time. When you live provisionally, you're not just postponing your own life. You're also, without meaning to, holding everyone around you at arm's length. Because true intimacy, with a partner, a friend, a child, even with your own work, requires presence. It requires you to actually be here, all the way here, betting on this. And the person in the holding pattern is never quite all the way here. Some part of them is always reserved, always waiting, always keeping a foot in the possible life they haven't committed to. The people who love them can feel it, even if they can't name it. There's a door that never fully opens, a held breath they can sense but can't reach. That's the loneliness at the center of the provisional life, and it's a loneliness you inflict without ever intending to. You're surrounded by people and reserved from all of them, because you're saving yourself for a real life that hasn't started. And the tragedy is that the real life was made of exactly those people, those ordinary moments, the whole time. It was never going to arrive later in some purer form. It was here, in the unglamorous present, waiting for you to stop holding your breath and actually breathe it in. Jung was clear that stepping out of the provisional life doesn't require blowing up everything you've built. That's a misreading people sometimes fall into. They hear, "Commit to your real life," and imagine they have to quit the job, leave the marriage, torch the whole structure and start over somewhere dramatic. Sometimes, rarely, that's what's genuinely called for. But far more often, the real life isn't somewhere else at all. It's this exact life, entered fully. It's the same house, the same work, the same relationships, but inhabited instead of endured, chosen instead of tolerated, lived in the present tense instead of held at a distance while you wait for the real one to begin. The change is often invisible from the outside. It happens entirely in the shift from provisional to committed, from later to now, from watching to living. And I think that's the most hopeful thing in all of this, because it means the real life you've been postponing isn't off in some distant, better set of circumstances you have to earn your way to. It's not waiting for the money or the timing or the readiness that never comes. It's been sitting right here the entire time, close enough to touch, patiently holding a place for you. The only thing standing between you and it is the sentence you keep telling yourself. Not yet. And the moment you stop believing that sentence, the moment you decide that this ordinary, uncertain, unfinished present is the real life, you're already in it. You crossed over the second you stopped waiting. You can't live like this forever. That's true, and there's no softening it. But Jung would want you to hear the other half of it too, the half the fear keeps you from noticing. You were never actually required to. The forever you were saving yourself for was always a mirage. The only life that was ever real is the one that's happening right now, while you read this, while you breathe, while some part of you finally starts to suspect that the waiting is over, and the beginning it kept promising is not up ahead somewhere. It's underfoot. It's already started. It started the moment you were willing to stop holding your breath. Something in you has probably known this for a long time. That restlessness, that ache on ordinary evenings, that recurring fantasy you never let yourself take seriously. That was never dysfunction. It was the truest part of you, the part that never signed the contract, quietly refusing to accept the postponement. It's been trying to get your attention for years. And the fact that you're still able to feel it, still able to ache for the life you haven't been living, means the door hasn't closed. It means you're still here, still able to walk through it. The people who worry me, Jung might say, aren't the ones in pain about their provisional life. They're the ones who've stopped feeling it entirely. Your discomfort is your aliveness, still awake, still calling you home. So the question isn't whether you're ready. You won't be. And Jung would tell you that no one ever is. The question is whether you're willing to stop treating your one actual life as a rehearsal for a performance that's never going to be scheduled. Whether you can set down the later you've been clutching and pick up the now that's been waiting for you. Whether you can finally exhale. If any of this has stirred something you can't quite put down, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this crossing. the move out of the holding pattern and into a life that's actually happening. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, made to help you look honestly at what you've been postponing, why you built the waiting room in the first place, and what it might mean to finally walk out of it. It won't hand you a finished answer. It'll walk beside you while you find your own. The link is right below, and whenever you're ready, or even before you feel ready, it'll be there.